Hello there, I'm Sherilyn Milsom, and today we are going to be discussing the legal aspects of rent to own. And joining me today is the infamous Barry McGuire. He has 40 years of experience as an attorney, and the emphasis of his practice is on buying and selling property. And he's the senior partner with RMLO Law Office in Edmonton, Canada. And he's come to be known as the investor lawyer. And you are also co-author, Barry, of 97 Tips for Canadian Real Estate Investors, a national bestseller. And you've been teaching creative real estate for how long now?
It's about 10 years we've been going along with our focus workshops. Yeah.
And those focus workshops, they focused on rent-to-own, agreements for sale, fix and flips. What else?
Assignments, options, joint ventures as they relate to creative real estate. So about six different creative strategies.
Excellent. So helping a lot of people with different creative real estate strategies then.
That's a big part of my practice and love doing it.
Perfect. Now, as far as rent-to-own goes, so you do have a lot of experience with that. And as a lawyer, how much do you get involved?
Well, it's interesting, Sherilyn. If you're my client, then I don't get involved very much because you're an experienced rent-to-own investor. And since a rent-to-own in its most basic form consists of a rental agreement or a lease and a second document called an option, for anybody who rents out property, they already have a lease. And so I don't get involved in drafting the lease. Once you've done a few options and you have your own option document that you like and you understand the mechanics of it, then for someone like you, Sherilyn, I wouldn't be involved at all. For someone who's just starting out, sometimes I consult. People call me up and say, Barry, I'm thinking of doing a rent to own. What the heck is that? Well, there's the consultation as you go through it. And I guess I get involved in looking at options because they come in all shapes and sizes, and there's often a fair bit of work to do on an option agreement.
So one way that you would get involved is reviewing contracts for clients to be sure they understand them and that that's the big thing, that they understand what they're getting into.
Yes, review of options especially is probably the biggest single thing I do in the rent-to-own, or RTO as we like to call it, field.
Okay. And so do you get involved in the financing side at all when it comes time for the tenant buyer to purchase the property?
I do get involved if the tenant buyer is looking to purchase. It depends where I am in the transaction. I could be acting for the landlord or for the seller, landlord seller, or the tenant buyer. So it depends where I am in the deal. But if I'm involved in financing as a lawyer, mostly it's just producing those mortgage documents that a lender sends me. The key part about financing that we've all learned is to get a lender to say yes. So getting involved in financing really starts at the very beginning when you set up an option in a way that will suit what a lender wants to see down the road when it's time to get a mortgage.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because there are certain terms that have to be in an option agreement, especially in Canada where people might be getting insured mortgages. There are terms that have to be in there for the mortgage company to accept them, correct?
Correct. And it's just best if they're there at the beginning and you're not recreating or redrafting or amending documents when it's time to close the deal.
Mm-hmm. And from a legal perspective, what would you say are the three most key factors in rent to own?
You know, the key factors. Let me just consult my notes, Sherilyn, because I made a few notes on this, and I'm just going to check. Yeah. So one big thing I think, when you're doing a rent to own, do you combine the lease and the option? Do you have them all in one document, or do you keep them separate? I believe you should keep them separate because a tenant might be a tenant forever. If they don't ever exercise the option, they're always a tenant. It's always easier to be in front of a judge or a hearing officer when your tenancy has gone sideways and you're only arguing about the lease when your tenant is pointing to the option. So I really believe in keeping the lease and the option separate.
Mhm.
The second thing is that options are a particular class of legal document where in common law jurisdictions, they are, as the cases say, strictly construed. So if you're in front of a judge arguing about an option, he will look at that option agreement and just make his judgment based on the words in the document. He doesn't look behind and say, well, what do these people really mean to do? Oh, they're telling me they meant this, but that's not what the document says. So options are strictly construed. They have to be clearly drafted so they'll stand a bit of judicial pushback if you're unfortunate enough to be in court. And then the other thing that doesn't come up too often, but when it does is really important, is to document changes to the deal. So
Mm.
great, you draft an option, it cruises along, it closes according to the option, everybody's happy, that's fine. But as we've all experienced, people who are buying by a rent-to-own scenario often have difficulties that need to be overcome, and sometimes they can't exercise their option within the required time. Sometimes the things that stop them from qualifying for a mortgage jump up and bite them during the course of the option, and they miss a payment or they're in default in some way. Sometimes it comes to the end of the option, they can't qualify, and things need to be extended. So if there's ever any changes to your deal, it's really, really important to have them detailed in writing so you've got a nice clear chain of documentation. So that's the third thing.
Yeah, and I could see how that wouldn't come up very often, but if it did, it would be really important. And the yeah, especially even just as simple as a renewal, if you have to have it in writing, you have to have it signed because it's going to take over what the previous contract was, correct?
Yes, and if you don't have it in writing, it's just he said, she said, and that gets murky, and it's very difficult to prove or say in court what an expired option is like when you haven't put it in writing. So get everything in writing.
Not only for court, but for the banks as well, because banks,
Yes.
they're not, they like things a certain way. And if your contracts don't follow or your documentation doesn't follow what's actually happening, they're not going to like that when it comes to financing.
No, they won't. When it comes right down to it, paper is very important. So document any changes nice and clearly would be my third legal point. That's very
excellent. No, you alluded to this before a bit, but because the tenant buyer is a tenant with an option to purchase, and some tenants may think they have an ownership interest in the property. So how could that happen that they think that, and what would be the issue there?
Well, I guess the first thing is that options are not really well known to the general public. People get into rent-to-owns because they want to own a property. They want to own. They can't qualify and get a mortgage and actually be the owner, but they want to own. So when they get into a rent-to-own, as much as they are just a tenant with a chance to buy under the document called the option, in their minds, they're an owner. In their minds, they're an owner. And so if the deal goes sideways and a tenant has put up a nice big chunk of option money, $25 or $30 or $50,000, if they put up that money and they can't qualify for a mortgage, or they're in default in the option, or in some other way they're offside the option, then their big chunk of option money, because of the nature of an option agreement, is going to go to the landlord. It's lost to them, and they see that money going out the window, and they don't want it to go out the window. So now they start grasping at straws to go, okay, well, how can I not lose my option money? And one way they can do that is to go, you know what? I'm not really a tenant with a chance to buy. I'm a buyer who's put down a nice big deposit. And the legal interpretation of being a buyer with a deposit is totally different than a tenant with a chance to buy. So they try and convert themselves into buyers who have paid deposits and then get the court to say, well, you shouldn't lose your deposit. So that's where it comes up.
Well, because a deposit, by nature, a deposit is usually refundable, right?
Deposits
under certain circumstances.
Yeah, under certain circumstances. Deposits are generally characterized as good faith money. so that you put up money to show your good faith or your intention to close a deal, but you have a better chance of getting back a deposit in a battle than you do of getting back your option consideration.
Yeah.
So
a big part of it is the wording. I know I've heard people call the option consideration, like the landlord seller calling the option consideration a down payment. And that certainly does imply that the tenant could have an ownership interest if they're being told that their money is a down payment.
Yes, that's a dangerous thing that we see in differently drafted option agreements. Money paid by the tenant buyer is sometimes referred to as a down payment, sometimes called a deposit, sometimes called purchase money. Purchase money. I'm a buyer if I'm purchasing. So all of those are drafting errors, and all of those are things that a tenant buyer can hang his hat on if you're having a fight down the road about you wanting to keep his option money, as you should be allowed under the option, and them wanting to get all their money back because they don't want to lose it.
Yeah, so that just emphasizes the point that a properly drafted document is so important.
It's ultra important.
Mm-hmm. Now, recently I did a broadcast on debunking rent-to-own myths, and one of those myths that came up was that rent-to-own is illegal in my area. So, from a legal perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, rent-to-own as an illegal strategy. So overall, I think, Sherilyn, what you've done in your rent-to-own business and what we've done in our focus workshops is we tried to rehabilitate the bad reputation of rent-to-own. In lots of circumstances, in lots of jurisdictions, unscrupulous landlords, sellers, find people who want to own a house and can't, and they put them into a property on a rent-to-own basis that has no chance of succeeding. So they get as big a chunk of option money as they can. They put a tenant buyer in, and then when the tenant fails because of complete incapability of getting a mortgage or solving their issues, the landlord says, "Oh, well, sorry. Nice try. I'm keeping your money. Out you go." And then they sell the property to another poor sod of a tenant buyer who has the same inability to qualify. So unscrupulous landlord sellers who do that have blackened the reputation of rent to own and have led to the notion that rent to own is illegal. In some jurisdictions, it's been so prevalent that local governments have set rules and laws about how rent to own works in their area. And so there may be certain jurisdictions where there are special rent-to-own rules, and so depending on where you are in North America, or in any common law jurisdiction in the world, actually, because really a rent-to-own, as we said before, is a combination of a lease and an option, and a lease and an option are absolutely well understood documents in any common law jurisdiction. You can go to England or New Zealand or the US or Canada, and if you say RTO with a lease option or is a lease option, everybody understands what you're talking about. So the notion of a rent to own is a well-known and not illegal concept. The world over, the difficulty is locally, where things have been so bad that you just have to know whether there are special rules in your jurisdiction. So that's diligence that you have to do wherever you live.
Well, and there are several, it just popped into my head about short-term rentals with the whole Airbnb thing. In certain jurisdictions, there are certain rules that you have to follow. Although Airbnb and short-term rentals are not illegal, there are certain rules that you have to follow in certain areas. So similar thing, I guess.
Well, it is kind of similar. Donna and I were recently in Victoria, and we were staying in a purpose-built condominium-type building. So it was purpose-built for short-term rentals prior to the city of Victoria putting in bylaws to regulate Airbnb. So locally, it's hard to do short-term rentals in British Columbia, depending on what city you're in. It's usually regulated municipally. So yeah, you got to watch out where you are and find out whether or not there are some local prohibitions on how rent-to-own works.
Okay. And Now, why is it so important as a rent-to-own seller that I would recommend that a tenant buyer get independent legal advice?
Well, I think it goes back to something we said earlier, which is rent to own, or lease option, as it's better described legally, isn't really that well known. So you might be talking to a tenant buyer and explaining as carefully as you can how it works and what all of the ups and downs are and what will happen if they default, and you can give a really good explanation of it. But if the deal goes sideways, as we said before, tenant buyers don't want to lose all the money that they've put up, and they will understandably look for any way to recover that money. So a really good way to protect yourself is to firstly decide whether you're going to strongly recommend or demand that your tenant buyer go and get independent legal advice. So you can go at it a couple of different ways. You can say, listen, we're not doing this deal unless you go see a lawyer and get him to explain it all to you. And then the lawyer will sign a certificate saying, I've met with the tenant buyer, I've explained everything to him, carry on with some details, and the tenant buyer appears to understand the nature of this deal. So that's your demanding that they go do it. Somehow it's difficult to get that as an immutable, we do it every time proposition in rent-to-own deals. It's just difficult to do. So what a lot of folks do is they strongly recommend that a tenant buyer get independent legal advice, and they explain in writing to them why that would be important, why it's better for the tenant buyer to go and see a separate lawyer, why it's in their very best interest to do it. And then if a tenant buyer fails to get independent legal advice and the deal goes sideways, what you've got in your file is your strong written recommendation that they go and see a lawyer and get advised on it. And if you're really careful about this, when you're going through the independent legal advice scenario with your tenant buyer, if they say, Sherilyn, gee, I don't want to do that. I trust you. Oh, I hate that. I trust you. The worst words around when there's a fight later on.
Yeah.
You probably say to them, listen, you might trust me, but this really is in your best interest. And just so you know, you're going to have to sign something saying, I told you that you should do this and why you should do it, and you're declining to do it. So it's on you, brother, not on me. So maybe you don't do it quite like that, Sharon, but you certainly want to bring it to their attention, and you certainly want to have something in writing saying you recommend it, because if there's a battle later on, you can truthfully say, listen, I, number one, explained it. I, number two, strongly recommended. I, number three, followed up with them. These folks declined. You can lead a tenant to water, but you can't make them get independent legal advice. And that will protect you to a large degree in a battle later on.
Yeah. Well, and it's, protection is of self is definitely important, but I think really the more important factor is that the tenant actually does understand, and we're making sure they understand. So it's always going to be better for them to have it explained by a third party. As you say, it is in their best interest, but you can't make them do it.
Yeah, but it's not you, and it's not the tenant buyer. It's some person who has no vested interest in the deal. That's what makes it independent, and that's what makes it good advice.
Mm-hmm. Now, last week I presented on rent to own and what to do when it goes wrong, and we were specifically talking about evictions and waivers and release of interest. Do you have any experience with any of that, or any thoughts on waivers of interest, release of interest in a property when a tenant is in arrears?
I dance around the edges of that aspect of rent to own. So when a deal is going sideways and it looks like it can't be recovered, the tenant buyer is just not going to be able to do what they're supposed to do under the deal. So I do get questions about it, but I'm not usually involved in either going off to court or to the RTDRS when things go sideways. I don't really get involved in that. I'm not a litigator, and it's just not what I do. But if a deal is going sideways, this is part of the paperwork thing we talked about earlier. Way better than having the tenant say, well, Sherilyn, gee, you know, I'm behind 3 months in my rent. I'm never going to be able to catch up. I've lost my job. I just can't do this deal. So we have to finish it off. You can say, you know, Bill, I understand all that. Shake hands, and I'm keeping your option money, but good luck with your next one. You can do that, or you can get a waiver of interest. I mean, it's a short document that really sets out that the tenant can't hold up his end of the deal, that he is confirming that he has no further interest. He's waiving, as we say, waiving his interest in the property, that he's waiving his interest in the property. And I mean, he understands how it's all going. You set it all out nice and logically. It doesn't have to be long. You can probably fit it on one page or maximum two. Mm-hmm. And then you finished your deal on paper, so that anybody shoots at you later on, you can hold it up and go, we talked about it. The tenant waived his interest. He understood exactly what he was doing. And here is the signed waiver of interest document. So I don't get involved in them, but I could get involved in that waiver of interest in the drafting of those, but I don't get involved in the going to court and evicting and sorting out the bills.
Mm-hmm. Now, rent to own in general is a fantastic strategy to make a lot more money when you sell your house. Now, you rather than the conventional way. And in a few weeks, you are going to be teaching another one of your focus workshops on agreement for sale, which is a fantastic way to buy a house without having to get a mortgage. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? They
Certainly.
Do kind of go hand in hand.
Well, they do go hand in hand. And so just a tiny bit of background, our course coming up September 14th in Red Deer is called Agreements for Sale Intensive, or AFS Intensive for short. So in that course, we're going to talk about the concept of the AFS, which is essentially seller financing. It's seller financing. A buyer gets to purchase a property with the seller being his bank. And of course, for buyers, that's usually good if you can't qualify for a new mortgage. For sellers who can't sell in a traditional sort of way, it's a way for them to sell a property where they don't have much equity in the property. And so within that strategy, in our AFS intensive program, we're going to do what I think is really a great way for students to learn. We're going to go over the basic concept of AFS, but then we're going to have our experts come in and go over real deals that they have done, right from start to finish. How did you find the deal? How did you figure out what the seller's motivation was? Why were they interested in talking about being your bank? How did you get to the numbers and the pricing? Because that's important. How did you put the paperwork together? And leaning into your end of things, Sherilyn, what was your exit strategy? So when you purchase a property by way of agreement for sale, sometimes the numbers don't work out exactly. So let me give you an example. This is one that one of our students from May Rapid Cash, because that was the Rapid Cash program here in Edmonton in May, which includes a segment on agreements for sale on AFS. Last week, a student finally got up the courage to put out a Facebook post on the fact that he wanted to buy properties, was contacted by a seller on an original price of $379,000. The property is worth $350,000 according to the realtor. You'll get about $340,000, says the realtor, based on people bargaining, and that's what you'll get. However, by the time you take into my real estate commission, your payout penalties, and some other monies that you're going to have to pay, you're only going to get about $310,000 on your sale price of $340,000, and the mortgage for this seller is $315,000. So he's only going to end up with $310,000, but his mortgage is $315,000 that he has to pay out. Not a palatable situation. The expenses on this property are about $2,200 a month.
Ooh.
The rental income is only about $1,800 a month. So as much as our student could buy the property for no money down, and he agreed to buy it for essentially the mortgage balance of $315,000, didn't make the seller write him a check for $5,000. So he's buying for $315,000, but now he's an owner who can only rent it for $1,800. So his exit strategy is a rent to own. So he's selling it by way of rent to own at a purchase price in the future of $350,000, which is today's value. He's not factoring in any appreciation, so that will be gravy on top of it. The mortgage pay down for this property is an amazing $12,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
He's got a 5-year term and a 5-year renewal. So even if it only goes for 5 years, he's going to pay down at 5 times 12, $60,000. And if he sells it for $350,000 in 5 years, that's another $35,000.
Yeah.
So he is about $100,000 ahead, even if the property doesn't go up in value. So he is selling by way of rent to own because it's a fabulous way to exit an AFS and actually make some real money. And I think, Sherilyn, you might have done 1 or 2 of these in your career.
Maybe a few.
Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about that situation with the rent being only $1,800, but the payments being $2,200, when you're doing a rent to own, often you're either getting a big chunk of money up front from the tenant buyer, or you're getting extra money every month on top of the rent. So either way, so the big chunk up front would cushion the negative cash flow every month, or the extra money every month would balance that out. So he may be getting total payments of $2,300 or something like that. So he's not out of pocket every month.
So yes, that's the plan. He thinks he'll between the rent and an extra option payment per month, he'll be around $2,200 or $2,300. Slightly positive cash flow, and of course he'll have to give the tenant buyer credit at the end when the tenant buyer cashes out. But he's got such a nice big cushion that a rent to own is a fabulous way to exit an AFS acquisition, and we'll be talking about that on September 14th in Red Deer.
Oh, and when we post the video, be sure to give us a link so we can direct people, because some people may actually be interested in picking up a property with no mortgage. So we'll make sure we get a link posted for your course. And yeah, because they really go hand in hand. It's like peanut butter and jelly. Just great.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that link gets on there. I also want to say that if anybody goes to barrymcguire.ca, that's Barry McGuire, one word, .ca, we'll have full details of it there as well, plus the link. But Sherilyn, since we're being very nice to each other, what about you? What about you and your course? I know you're doing them, but I don't really know the details. Tell me, I do want to know for my own interest.
Yeah, I'm actually doing a rent-to-own exit strategy course very soon. The exact date isn't known yet, but we'll post a link as well for people to get more information on that, because yeah, it's basically anyone who has a property that they want to sell and they just want to make more money than they would by selling it through a realtor. So it's, as you say, it can make so much more money. And yeah, so that's what the course is going to teach, step by step, how to do a rent to own for an exit.
Okay, so folks, this is unsolicited, and Sherilyn doesn't know I'm going to say this. I just want to say that I've worked with Sherilyn over a number of years. She's attended our focus workshop. She's been is a focus team leader, and Sherilyn understands rent to own top to bottom. She understands every aspect of it. She understands the legal side of it. I would say the best, or almost the best, of any client or person I've ever worked with. So not only kind of the middle part of it, she also understands the marketing part of it, how you find deals, the middle part of it, how you put them together, the legal side of it, how those documents really work, and how to have a fight about it if people want to have a fight about it. She's also really good at that side of it. So I haven't I haven't seen or been to Sherilyn's course, but I have total confidence that it will be worth every penny. And if you're interested in rent to own, you should sign up right now.
Well, thank you. I think I'm blushing.
Well, it's all true.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And Barry, thank you for joining us. This has been very educational, and it's been a pleasure to have you on today.
Sherilyn, it was a lot of fun. If there's other opportunities that we can do stuff, I'm happy to dig in and help out.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.